Hi, this is Jason. What in the world does the biblical book of Genesis have to do with recovery? Well, I'm watching this series here. It's Jordan Peterson with a roundtable of experts talking about the book of Exodus. They read through it verse by verse, and then they stop along the way to provide commentary. And I'm finding that as they do that, many times I'm able to relate what they're talking to the topic of addiction. In this particular section right here, they've just finished reading where the Lord sent a plague on Egypt. Pharaoh was frustrated with all the frogs. He told Moses and Aaron, "Tell your God to knock this off, tell him to stop the plague, and then I'll let the people go." And as soon as the plague is ended, Pharaoh recants and he goes right back to his previous position of he is going to, keep the Israelites. He's not going to let them out of slavery. And from this, they've had a really interesting discussion about what role do we play in bad stuff that we do, and what role does circumstances or God hardening our hearts or something else. And along the way, Jordan Peterson begins to talk about his daughter. She apparently had a very serious illness when she was a child, and it was unclear whether, for example, if she didn't want to go to school in the morning, it was unclear whether or not that was because of her illness and she really just couldn't physically manage it, or whether, as kids sometimes do, she was trying to, take it easy and get out of things. And so he has this very interesting conversation with her in which he says, just be brutally honest about this. Try what you can, and if you can't, we'll believe you that you can't do it, but don't use it as a crutch because that will absolutely ruin your life. And as we live in an age in which people just really don't like the idea of alcoholism and drug addiction being anything other than a disease, I think similar issues come up. Do I have the DUI because I have a disease or because I made a bad choice? Am I locked up in jail because I have a disease or because of trauma I suffered as a kid? Or because I've done something wrong, I've made some bad decisions along the way. It's a tough one to get straight. And Jordan is saying, it was really difficult for him. He didn't want to tell his daughter, get your butt out of bed and go to school. I don't want to hear this. He also didn't want to allow her to let herself off the hook if she really could go. And it's something that we all have to contend with in addiction. And let's just hear a little bit of their discussion. I think they have some excellent points.
Which would be perfectly understandable under the circumstances. It will do nothing at all but make the situation far worse.
Yeah, it's true that the boundary between sin and syndrome has got more and more blurred.
That's good. The boundary between sin and syndrome has gotten more and more blurred. Boy, do we just hate that word sin. We would rather call it anything other than sin.
The idea that moral failure can become so easily pathologized, and in pathologizing it, we risk fixing it. It becomes
wow. Moral failure can become pathologized. So in other words, we take that's a bad thing that you did, that is a sin, and we go, no, it's actually some kind of pathology. It's a psychological issue. And he's saying we risk saying it's something that can be fixed. That's interesting. And I do think that is exactly how we're looking at addiction right now. We're looking at it as a pathology, as a culture, right? We're looking at it as a pathology that can be fixed rather than something that is wrong that we did.
sort of part of who we are, as opposed to something that we can be redeemed from, that we can confess and repent from.
We also...
Anyone who's ever been to a resilient meeting will know that's the format of the meeting. We confess, we repent, and we receive forgiveness. So he's saying first that it's something that we could fix. That if we pathologize it, then it's not good or bad. It's just something that we need the proper medication or treatment to be able to remedy. He's also saying that it risks becoming part of us, that it's part of our identity. And that's a whole thing. So you've got in AA people saying, my name is John, I'm an alcoholic. And in AA, they really encourage you to say that so that you don't ever forget and then say, I can have a little bit, and you go out and you have a bender and bad things happen. That's their rationale for doing that. There's another pretty prominent group in the U.S. called Celebrate Recovery, and they encourage you to introduce yourself. Hi, I'm Jason. I'm a child of God. That who my identity is not this thing that I did or this illness that I have. My identity is that of a child of God. I've been adopted. I'm struggling with this other stuff, but it's not who I am. And so people go back and forth about this idea of, is alcoholism, is it an identity I should claim? Or is it a behavior that I should change? Right now, there's very few voices out there saying it's a sin that I should repent from.
It also moves to possession. Jonathan and I were discussing this a little bit with this, mental health pandemic that we're seeing all around us, but particularly in teenagers, where it's you have depression, you have anxiety, rather than you're in a healing crisis, right? There's a beginning, a middle, and end. It doesn't mean you won't have another one and another one, but you're at least oriented in some ritualistic meaning to integrate into incorporate.
The illness isn't an ingredient in your identity. It's something that you can, in principle.
And you're going to blow out at your weak points always. It could happen again and again. Life is a series of hero quests and healing crises. But we tend to talk about.
So that's really interesting because the guy in the white blazer has said it's a sin that you can repent from, which I think is a very Christian understanding of alcoholism. It's all throughout the Bible, discussions of not becoming drunk and of wine being a brawler and so on. Then this other guy in the kind of gray jacket, he's looking at it and he's talking about it really from the perspective of story. Or I would say he's even going back to kind of the myths of the Vikings. He's like Odin. We have a hero's quest, and we're gonna take this thing on. We're gonna slay the dragon, and it's two very different ways of looking at it, but both of them are religious-ish ways of looking at it. Whereas the pathologizing, you're just sort of looking at it like you look at a frog and that's about to be dissected, and you're just looking for the pathology and trying to cut it out. There's no emotional valence around it. There's no lived experience. It's just, you've got that thing on you and I'm going to get it out. So some very different ways of looking at it, but I think you can look at addiction through all those lenses too. It's this disease that I need a cure from. It's a sin that I need to repent from. It's a challenge that I need to overcome. All of those things at once, I think, are metaphors that people use as they're dealing with addiction. And this book of Exodus has caused all these thinkers to bring up all these different ways of looking at it and different facets of looking at the situation where I'm doing something that I don't want to do, or I've done something and I'm struggling with the after effects of that and I'm trying to never do them again.
We must remove this, right?
Well, you can degenerate, I suppose, into what happens to Job is he's cursed by God in some real sense, or by Satan at least, and then he's sick to death and scraping his wounds with potsherds by the fire, and then his friends come along and say, well, obviously you did something to deserve this, which is often the case for sick people, right? It's not only are they sick, but everybody thinks, well, if you would have just behaved better, it's like, and so that's part of the problem, right? Is that, and I guess that's why it's so important to so carefully separate the wheat from the chaff. It's like, well, we found this a lot when dealing with my daughter when she was so sick, because, for example, if she wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, it's like, well, what do you do about that? Do you attribute to the illness? Do you blame it to the illness? Do you let her off the hook? And the answer is, you pay as much attention as you possibly can. So she moves ahead as much as she can, but no more. And that judgment is it's so difficult to make, especially with someone who's ill.
And maybe that's part of.
So I think that's really interesting. For anyone who's either looking at themselves or even trying to help somebody else, what he says is, I don't know. It's really hard to figure out. Do I cut you slack? Or do I demand a higher standard of behavior from you? And he says he certainly doesn't want to be the person like Job's friends who are like, well, the reason all this bad stuff is happening to you is because you did some kind of sin. You behaved bad. We do that all the time. Why does somebody have a heart attack? They ate too much bacon and they didn't exercise. Why does somebody have addiction? They hung out with the wrong people and they partied too much, and then it eventually got a hold of them. You could devolve into just kind of blaming the victim and making someone feel worse. So what Jordan is saying there is, what needs to happen is you need to pay close attention. So rather than say, that's kind of how I see it. You're bad. You're over there. I've turned you into a caricature and I'm only noticing one thing about you and I'm shaking my finger at you. He's saying what you need to do is get to know the person very well and be very observant and be cognizant of the fact that this could be you've got an illness and you need additional support, and I shouldn't put you in a situation where you're going to fail or you are going to atrophy if I don't push you a little bit. How do I sort that out? He's saying, pay attention, get to know the person better, get closer to them, don't separate from them. Very interesting stuff.
Our scattered attention and focus right now, right? I mean, if everything moved from, texts to blogs to posts to tweets to Instagram, right? Like our attention is so focused that maybe that's part of the process of collapsing the space you said between sin and syndrome, because it's not that complicated in some ways, to have that sort of conversation with somebody. Like
right,
the conversation
but it has to be personal, right?
Well, and you have to really slow down and take time in the morning to say, okay, what's going on? Can you really knock it out?
Has to be personal. Yes, a specific, following a program and not looking at the individual, you're going to run into trouble. You also have to slow down when you talk to people. This is totally applicable to either looking at yourself and what you should be asking of yourself, and also when you're trying to help somebody else.
Syndrome, yeah, exactly.
Right, like, exactly. Okay, you can't get out of bed, great, we'll try tomorrow. Or, it's a very delicate proposition because you're dealing with people's vulnerabilities. And if you get it wrong...
Well, and you also have to help them test it. So I remember one time we were going to buy her a scooter so she could get around. And so she had to go and take motorcycle lessons, and somebody crashed the motorcycle a bit at one of the lessons, and she woke up in the morning and she was afraid to go. And no wonder, she just had a hip replacement. So she was on like a motorbike 3 weeks later. And so it was risky, but we thought, man, this kid's got to be able to move around. And she was afraid to go. And so her mother said to her, why don't you just get out of bed and come with me in the car? And then when you get there, you can see if you can do this or not, and maybe you can't. And then, well, when she got there, and so that was that judicious.
That is so right on. I'm dealing with a lot of folks right now that have been in recovery for a while, 6 months, 3 months, a year, and they're right on the cusp of, should I go back to work? And they're real worried that if they go back to work, They're gonna get a paycheck and they're gonna fall off again. And I like the solution. Well, let's help you test yourself. It's your test. You're the one that has to determine whether or not this ultimately the recovery is up to you. But let's devise a test and see how you do with it. In this case, let's get in the car and let's go there and let's see how you feel once you're there. So it might be, let's fill out a few job applications and let's do a couple of interviews. Let's see how you're feeling at that point. But you and I, let's get real personal and talk about whether or not your mind is starting to shift now into, I want to bounce out of this rehab and go drink on the street, or is my mind still in with fear and trembling? I'm going to go to work, and when I get my first paycheck, here's what I have planned so that I won't use it. I think this is great, just getting very personal and working with somebody step by step through the process. Fantastic. This is exactly what you would do with someone that you're working with in recovery, and exactly what you do with yourself as well. If I'm worried, if I go back to this situation, I'm going to relapse. Maybe you just don't go back to that situation. Maybe at a certain point in your recovery, you go, okay, I'll go back with a friend, and these will be this is how I'm going to test myself, and this is what we'll do afterwards to debrief and try and understand that situation.
Pushing, is it sin or syndrome? Well, it's no wonder you're afraid. And so we think we're crazy in some sense. Like, you just had your hip replaced. Now we're putting you on a motorbike. That's a big risk. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe you're right to be afraid. And so then you test it, right? That's collaborative empiricism. That's what the behaviorists call it. It's like, well, maybe this is the right way forward. Why don't we go out and test it a little bit?
Well, and it takes an incredible amount of empathy without falling into complete empathy. Mm-hmm. Right? Because you
It does. It takes an incredible amount of empathy without falling into complete empathy. You can't not like the person. That's not going to work. So you need to have empathy for them. However, if you have so much empathy that you're just emoting and you're nurturing and you're caring and you're empathizing, but you don't go, hey, I don't think that's a good idea, the person's going to end up getting into trouble. So I'm going to stop the video here. There's a lot more here. If you guys have the ability to get the Daily Wire subscription and check out this whole conversation, this is one part of part 4 of what I think what's going to be like an 8-part series. Very good stuff. Very applicable. Absolutely fantastic. Hope you enjoyed this.